Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is Sándor, Petőfi, Poems of Love and Freedom. And friends, for this very discussion and lecture, we have with us in our studio our subject expert, Dr. Margit Govesh. She is a visiting lecturer, Department of Slavonic and Finno-Ugrian Studies, University of Delhi. With this brief introduction, I'd like to welcome her and also request her to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, ma'am.
Thank you, Urvashi. At the end of the March lecture on Hungarian literature, Romanticism 2, we spoke about the influence of folk poetry and 19th century populism on Petőfi's poetry. This folk poetry is a very important element of the formation of Hungarian national identity in the 19th century. I think this is a relevant topic for India because folk poetry and motifs along with the local languages are used in modern Indian poetry to a great extent. The subtitle of the lecture is Freedom and Love. Freedom is a political and philosophical idea, but in Hungary, the political context was constantly relevant because of the Habsburg, the Austrian suppression in Hungary. Petőfi struggled against Austrian suppression in Hungary, but he wanted liberty not only for Hungarians, but in a universal sense. In the context of nation and suppressed classes. Love, the other idea is that love and freedom are two modern ideas, modern in the sense that with Enlightenment and especially with Romanticism came into the public consciousness. Love is also an exercise of personal freedom, and this is the age of great loves, especially in Hungary. We see touching stories of how the great Hungarian writers and poets like Petőfi himself found his beloved, in this case Julia Szendrei. In this lecture I'm going to speak about first folk poetry and Petőfi's epic poem Tale John the Valiant, János in Hungarian. Then I'll speak about the poetic cycle, Clouds, which was published in 1846. And then I'll speak about Petőfi's major directions of poetry, love poetry, revolutionary poetry, which is connected with freedom, and landscape poetry. In the first half of the 19th century, there were discussions in Hungary and elsewhere what can be called in Hungarian népies or in English popular, something that belongs to the people. The generation before Petőfi wanted to ennoble the folk song. Petőfi had a different attitude to folk literature. Petőfi's interest in folk poetry meant a turn against the polished language of the classicists and the rhetorics of the romantics. The German Grimm dictionary, which was published, this was the dictionary of the Grimm brothers, the tale collector Grimm brothers, published in 1838, defined the folk poet, Volksdichter as they say, in the following way. The poet of the people is who uses important and understandable objects for his poems and writes in a language that can be understood by the people. It meant addressing an audience that was different from the earlier aristocratic upper middle class audience. Oral poetry became very important in this age. Homer's Odyssey and Iliad were discussed in this context. And the songs of Ossian, the author James Macpherson decided to remain in disguise of this researcher who discovered the text, were also very important. we can see in Petőfi's poetry that he often uses the metaphors of Hungarian folk poetry, but he develops them differently. In the March lectures, 2 poems of Petőfi were read out, which were written in the style of folk poetry, oral poetry. One was Plans Gone Up in Smoke, which depicts a meeting between mother and son, Petőfi's mother and Petőfi's visit home, and the other one was I'll Be a Tree. This was addressed to his beloved Berta Mednyarszky at the time. The early poems of Petőfi represent a broad range of situations, and they are often called role-playing poems. In the poems 1842-44, this is the first collection of Petőfi's poetry, Petőfi composed a number of popular songs, pseudo-folk songs on wine, love, rubbers. And he used a variety of voices. Petőfi created a well-formed persona for himself, a jaunty, stubborn loner who loves wine and who hates all kinds of limitations and boundaries and is passionate about what he feels. These poems were also called role poems. In the slide which is in front of you, Orlai Petri Soma's painting, portrait painting, presents Petőfi in this role. The painting was prepared 18 years after Petőfi's death in 1867. Petőfi died in 1849. So this is Orlai Petri Soma's painting, Petőfi in Debrecen. This was in about, this presents him in a situation in about 1842 or even earlier in the end of 1830s. What are the characteristics which Petőfi took over from folk poetry? One is the everyday use of language. The other one is the voice from the people, the immediacy with which he turns to his audience, the various roles in everyday situations, the rhythm of folk poetry, the simplicity of the folk poems, and the Hungarian collective personality to which Petőfi turned in these poems. In 1842, János erdélyi, a critic and a philosopher, in his study about folk poetry, described the poets as a person who finds his world in family life, which are the same all over the world. And because of this, the purely human has to be found in family life. Here, man is without any disguise. What does then the force of folk poetry consist in, asks János erdélyi. It consists mainly in the language, in the transparent, pure, noble performance, which any sober and healthy mind can understand and enjoy according to their taste. So educated poetry should take on the purity of folk poetry, its brave, independent connections, tones, features of life, which are not justified by syntax and grammar. Erdélyi in this study separates what is beautifully natural, and he compares this to gold, and to the vulgar, what is he compares to dross. In the same piece, he speaks about the roughly natural, which he associates with the dregs of society. Erdélyi's study broke away from the earlier aristocratic notion of the nation that considered only the aristocracy and the nobility as part of the nation. Those who came into the territory of Hungary roughly 1986 and belonged to the ruling tribes of Hungary, and that's why they became the aristocracy of Hungary. He separated elements of society as dregs and vulgar. And he compares the vulgar to the beautifully, and he contrasts the vulgar to the beautifully natural. In the 19th century, in the context of nation, natural, people, folk, these concepts were elaborated. The selection of the register also became very important. In this process, the vulgar and the wild were separated from the natural. We will see how these were used in the context of Petőfi's epic, John the Valiant. The Hammer of the Village, his earlier epic poem, and John the Valiant, János Vitéz in Hungarian, the two epic poems written by Petőfi can be to a great extent contrasted to Mihály Vörösmarty's epics. Vörösmarty wrote the Flight of Zalán, the Valley of Fairies, and the two neighboring forts. Epics were very popular at the phase of early Romanticism in Hungary, but Vörösmarty wrote these epics before 1831. And they were based on epics as an aristocratic concept with different protagonists and different audiences. Petőfi's Hammer of the Village, Helységkalapácsa, or John the Valiant, János Vitéz, deal with village communities and village heroes, take up locations of organic, universal communities. The location Erdélyi also referred to in his lecture, but Petőfi depicts these places in their pettiness, in their internal divisions. The title of the poem, John the Valiant, János Vitéz, contrasts with the name of the hero in the first canto, Kukorica Jancsi in Hungarian, which was translated by the translator John Ridlund into Johnny Grain o' Corn. He is a village boy busy grazing the sheep of his stepfather in Canto 1. In the 27 cantos of the epic poem, Johnny's life goes through complete transformation. I would like our viewers to listen to the first canto of the poem, where Johnny Jancsi is out at the brook looking at his beloved Iluska in Hungarian, who was renamed in the English translation of the poem Nelly. So I request Urvasi to read the first canto of the poem.
Right. So friends, this is the first canto, as ma'am said, of John the Valiant, and I shall read it out. I hope I can do justice to it. And the blistering sun in the midsummer sky beats down on the shepherd boy from on high. No need for the sun to be blazing above. Inside him the shepherd is burning with love. With fiery young love his heart is blazing. At the edge of the village his sheep are grazing. Past the edge of the village they are grazing all over, while he lolls on his sheepskin cloak in the clover. A sea of bright flowers spreads wide around him, but it isn't the colorful flowers that astound him. A stone's thrown off, where a brook flows, there his gaze is fixed in a steady stare. And it is not fixed on the brook's bright swirl, but on what's in the brook, a blonde-headed girl. Fair-headed and one of the slenderest, with long golden braids and rounded breast. Up over her knees her skirt is hooked, while she scrubs her wash in the fresh, clear brook. And her two pretty knees peep into sight, to Johnny Grain O'Corn's great delight. Yes, the shepherd lolling there in the grass is Johnny Grain O'Corn, and the lass, who's scrubbing her laundry in the stream, is Ilushka, the pearl of Johnny's dream. Ilushka, Nelly, my dear heart's pearl. This is how Johnny cried out to his girl. In the whole wide world, you can take my word, you are the only one who makes me feel like a lord. Smile up at me with your slow-eyed look, let me give you a hug, come out of the brook. For a moment just give your laundry the slip, and I'll plant my soul on your rosy lip. I'll gladly come out, Johnny dear, you know, I have to get on with my washing though. Hurry, hurry, or catch it from someone or other. You know I'm a stepchild and you know my stepmother. The beautiful Nell answered him with a smile, while she scrubbed away at her laundry pile. But Johnny jumped up from his sheepskin coat, moved closer, and coaxed her on this note. Come out, my dove, come up, my pigeon. A hug and a kiss won't take but a smidgen. Besides, your stepmother's nowhere near. Don't leave your sweetheart languishing here. With his blandishments, he coaxed her out. With his two hands, he clasped her waist about, and he kissed her mouth. 1 time, 100. Only he who knows all things could get them numbered.
Thank you, Urvashi. So, Johnny and Nelly hug and kiss till the evening, when the girl's stepmother comes angry and shouting, and Johnny realizes that the sheep in his custody has all scattered and he would not be able to find them. He spends one night he has to run away. His stepfather is very furious when he hears the news of the sheep being lost, and he has to run away. And he spends one night with the robbers in a hut in the forest. This was a realistic detail within the tale itself, because runaway village boys in the 19th century very often ended as highwaymen. We call them betyár in Hungarian, and this is what you call in Hindi dákús. So they became dákús. Later, Johnny meets hussars, becomes a member of the Hungarian army, and rescues the daughter of the French king. He refuses, though the French king offers his daughter's hand, he refuses to marry her because he remembers his Ilushka, his Nelly. He's awarded gifts, given a new name, John the Valiant. On the ship home, he's sent home by ship. On the ship, he becomes shipwrecked, and he escapes holding on to a cloud, and later on, he's taken to his village by a giant bird. He finds out in his village that Nelly died. Nobody knows in the village who he is. Johnny starts wandering again, and after he picks up a rose from Nelly's grave, and he reaches beyond the 7 seas after defeating various obstacles. Here he reaches Fairyland. He cannot find his happiness, so he throws the rose into the lake in Fairyland, which turns out to be the lake of life. So out of the rose, Ilushka rises, she comes to life, and the fairies ask them to remain in Fairyland and become king and queen. So as you see, as you saw in the illustrations, we have various performances. We have cartoons of John the Valiant. We have drawings made, not only cartoon films, and this is, for example, part of a puppet performance where you can see Ilushka, Nelly, and John. We also have an opera which has been running since the end of the 19th century, Pongrácz Kacsó's opera of John the Valiant, and even now there was a performance in 2013. So it is still very strongly part of our culture. In John the Valiant, we find very interesting and funny parts. Petőfi has a special ear for fun. There is a joke. He created special geography for the poem. The army marches through Poland, and they arrived in the land of the Poles in this way, and from Poland they rode through to India. So India and Poland are bordering countries in this tale. France is the nearest of India's neighbors, though the travel between them is the hardest of labors. In India's heart, you climb hill after hill. So these are the Himalayas in John the Valiant, and these hills pile up higher and higher until by the time that you reach the two countries' frontier, up as high as the heavens, the peaks rear. So all kinds of, this was the kind of stories which veteran soldiers must have told to their audiences in the village communities, and Petőfi picked up a lot of material from this. Here you see the map of these countries. The names are given in Hungarian, but you can see how India lies next to France, and Hungary, Tartary is between Africa and Hungary. Later on, they had a special way of, the army has a special way of life. Again, there is a lot of fun in the description. They had nothing at all for their rations, meaning the army, but air, stacked so thickly that they could bite into it there, and their drink was peculiar, it must be allowed. When thirsty, they squeezed water out of cloud. So it is enjoyable for all generations, because adults also derive a lot of pleasure from reading this poem. The genre of John the Valiant was another issue. It has been changing from age to age. It was first perceived as a folk tale between 1844 and 1865, and after that as an epic. In the first interpretation, Petőfi's ennobling influence was emphasized, yet the strongest influence was Vörösmarty's influence, but not in the sense of ennobling, but in the sense of the yearning protagonist and his search for an aim in life and for his search for happiness in life. The narrator of John the Valiant reveals himself in all kinds of ways, in tones, in his asides, ironic stresses, and in his naivety, pretended naivety, which is his spontaneity. Petőfi creates romantic poetry and asks about the relevance of folk poetry in this way. Hungarian Romanticism interpreted the realization of national spirit in various ways, but Petőfi had his own approach. After Petőfi's poem, John the Valiant, another, here we see the army, Hungarian army moving. After Petőfi's poem, John the Valiant, another epic poem came out, and this was Toldi, written by János Arany, whom you see in the middle of this double portrait of János Arany and Petőfi. This was published in 1846. Petőfi wrote a letter after reading the poem. Here you see Petőfi, the letter in Petőfi's handwriting, written in February 1847 from Pest. The English translation of this letter was, and from this you can see the kind of personality which Petőfi had. Greetings to you. I read Toldi today and I wrote this poem. It will be published in Életképek, in one of the journals. But I want to convey to you the surprise, the happiness, enthusiasm that your work roused in me. Folk poetry is real poetry. We have to do everything to make it rule. If the people will have the power over poetry, they are very close to ruling in politics. And this is the task of the century. To fight for this is the target of every noble person who are sick to see how millions suffer so that a few thousand people could idle their time away and enjoy themselves. To heaven with the people, to hell with the aristocracy. Write to me if you are not lazy. Anything, everything. How old are you? Are you married or unmarried? Blonde or brown? Tall or short? Everything interests me. Goodbye. Abin Viziz is your friend Petőfi Sándor in the Hungarian order. You put first the family name. So this was the beginning of a very great friendship. Arany, he visited Arany in June in that year, 1847. He wrote a poem, Children, which is the pearl of Hungarian children's literature ever since. When he got married in the same year, they went to the Arany couple, and when they had their little son, Zoltán Petőfi, then the godparents of the little boy became Arany János and his wife. From 1845 to 1847, Petőfi writes in a number of genres, drama, travel notes, and he continued also with his poetry. He also has a creative crisis, which is expressed in the collection Clouds, Felhők, written in a period of 3 to 4 months, in the end of 1845 and beginning of 1846. These short poems are short. These poems are very short, one stanza. They are like epigrams, but they are fragmented. And they turn towards the lyrical eye. They express the emotional strain and anxiety. These 66 poems of Clouds form a special cluster in Petőfi's work. We will look at some of the poems in Petőfi's Clouds. The first poem which we are going to look at is the poem Sorrow. Sorrow was translated by W.H. Auden. Can you read this poem? No, this is not that. Okay. So the poem is Clouds is sorrow, a great ocean, joy, a little pearl of the ocean. Perhaps by the time I fish it up, I may break it. The speaker connects the two metaphors, ocean and pearl, and sorrow identifies sorrow with the ocean and joy with pearl. In the last line, by using I fish it up, he connects the sea pearl and also his own activity. By the time I fish it up, I may break it. Another beautiful piece is on humankind. Humankind has not declined. This poem can be related to one of the poems I spoke in an earlier lecture about. This was Vörös Marty's on humankind. This is, it expresses the disillusionment of the lyrical eye and the doubts about evolution. Evolution or decline, these are two sides of history, and Petőfi was doubting at this point evolution as such. Metaphors also play a role in this. Humankind has not declined. It has been evil since the fall. Or else there was no need at all to make up stories of God and salvation, Satan and damnation to curb its abominable mores. The translation was done by Peter Tolman. So God and salvation are contrasts with Satan and damnation. And the stories of Bible are emphasized and are very important. Petőfi was an atheist, and the name of giving Zoltán to his son was not accidental. What I mentioned earlier, the Zoltán comes from the Turkish Sultan. And he said, at least I can give a paganic name to my son. The crisis of which he expressed in Clouds leads to new poetics, new voice. And after the cycle Clouds, three major themes evolve in his poetry: love, universal freedom, in the context of society, politics, and the third theme was Hungarian landscape. So we see here Julia Szendrei, Petőfi's love and his wife. On the 15th of March 1847, just 1 year before the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution, 15th March 1848, Petőfi's collected works were published with a short poem, epigram, that became the motto of the collection. I request Urvashi to read out this short poem.
Is it the poets of the 19th century?
No, this is My Freedom, My Love in English. That's the first one. My Freedom, My Love.
All right. Right. So friends, I'm reading out this poem, My Freedom, My Love, as ma'am pointed out clearly. So it goes like this: My freedom, my love, I need them both. For my love, I would sacrifice my life. For my freedom, I would sacrifice my love.
So this is a translation by Terry and Vijay Varma. The poem expresses a hierarchy of values, and he places his love above his life, and he's ready to sacrifice his life for his freedom. So these double themes, love and freedom, which is also title of our lecture, was very relevant in Petőfi's poems. Very often the two themes get entwined and are expressed together. Now I'll speak very briefly about Petőfi's love poetry. The poem I'll be a tree was read out last time, Fa leszek, ha te leszel virága. This is again was a folk song. Petőfi's love poems as soon as they were published in the newspapers, one could even say with the metaphor, metonymy, that they almost jumped off the pages of the newspapers. Immediately they were picked up and composed into music. So this is also a very popular piece of music. The next poem is The Bush Trembles, in Hungarian Reszket a bokor. Here the bush trembles because he thinks about his beloved, and his heart trembles. The bush trembles because a little bird settled on it, and the poet's heart trembles because he thinks about his beloved. He uses objects of nature like the river Danube, and then also summer and winter, and parallels them to his feelings. And then finally, in the final stanza of this poem, says, if you don't love me, then you should be blessed, but if you love me, then you should be blessed 100 times. And to this, Julia answered that then he's blessed 1,000 times, and this is how she accepted his proposal in spite the opposition of his parents. The next poem, End of September, was written at the time of their honeymoon. He was looking at the snow-capped hills, and it reminded him of the passage of time and mortality, and what would happen if he should die. The poem, What Shall I Call You, Minek Nevezzelek, is a 5-stanza poem. The 5 stanzas consists of 2 questions in the beginning of the stanzas. What shall I call you? And the idea is that language is too poor to express his feelings. In the last stanza, he gives an answer. What shall I call you? My young, beautiful, lovely wife. The love theme in the poem, Sad Autumn Winds Speak to the Trees. The lovely theme is joined with the revolutionary theme. Here he describes a situation when his wife naps next to him while he reads his Bible. He says, the history of revolutions. And we know that this was Lamartine's book about the history of French revolutions. And this is the poem of Sad Autumn Winds Speak to the Trees. One of the main features of Petőfi's revolutionary poetry is that the theme of freedom of the individual is only possible with the worldwide extension of freedom, not only of the nation, but also of the universal freedom. In the poem, the poets of the 19th century, his contemporaries, the poets are at rest, and he propagates his art of poetry as ars poetica and relevance of the age. The poet addresses his contemporary as a visionary, a chosen poet. I request Urvashi to read out this poem, The Poets of the 19th Century.
This is Petőfi's The Poets of the 19th Century, as ma'am just told us. Let no one with a languid finger dare to sweep the strings today. The lyre that's lifted up is ready to get a great work underway. If you can sing of nothing better than your own joy or broken heart, the world can do without your singing. Keep out where you can have no part. We wander in the wilderness like Moses and his ancient folk, following the fiery pillar, God has sent to guide his flock. In our days, God has ordered poets to be the fiery pillars and so to lead the wandering people.